Hi, everyone. Welcome to Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. This broadcast is brought to you by Mace Media Group and Terpenes and Testing Magazine, the industry's first publication dedicated to cannabis science. I'm Jason Lupoi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Terpenes and Testing Magazine, and I'll be your host as we navigate across the landscape of cannabis and psychedelics science. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a movement of people who considered cannabis and psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD to be enlightening and empowering. They were part of a counterculture that sought to squash and change the diatribe that we've been fed regarding these substances, and they utilized these substances to find themselves, happiness, health, and a better quality of life. But Richard Nixon had a different agenda. A Nixon administration henchman named John Ehrlichman basically said that they knew they couldn't make it illegal to be against the Vietnam War, but by getting the public to associate cannabis and psychedelics with the hippies and then heavily criminalizing those substances, they could disrupt the communities. And it was all political, of course, and without data. As a result of these political efforts against this movement, Hunter S. Thompson went on to say, "We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west. And with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark, the place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. The dream was over. But our interest in these substances has been resurrected, and we have consistently been shown the power that these plants and substances can have medicinally, psychologically, and even spiritually now that scientists are more permitted to study them. The swiftness that they can provide humanitarian relief is almost magical. And so I'd like to think that that legendary wave that Thompson referred to is gaining momentum once again. So for this episode, I wanted to speak with David Heldreth. I read something that said if you combine 2 parts Walter Cronkite, 1 part the aforementioned Hunter S. Thompson, and 1 part Mr. Wizard, and roll it all into a joint, you'd get a pretty good idea of who David Heldreth is. David is a longtime journalist covering everything from hurricanes in the British Virgin Islands to LAPD manhunts. However, his recent work has brought him back to his passion of cannabis and to psychedelics. David's work cultivating and educating patients with medical cannabis collectives led him to the Workshop and Jeffrey Raber, who were offering terpene and cannabinoid profiling services to growers around 2010. And these early tests alerted Heldreth to the existence of terpenes, CBD, the entourage effect, and the numerous other compounds the plant created. The knowledge of terpenes and ability to test for them also led him to develop his company, Panacea Plant Sciences, and patent formulas for cultivators to increase terpenes and potency in cannabis. Panacea Plant Sciences is a biotechnology company that develops a portfolio of cultivation and related IP and patents around the cannabis plant, psychedelic life forms, and formulations. David has testified at the FDA, the White House, the USDA, the DEA, and the World Health Organization, along with several state legislators and agencies. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. Sometimes I forget what's happened over the last 10 years or so as an accumulation.
Yeah, it sounds like you've surely been busy.
It feels that way, and it just keeps growing. I seem to like keeping myself busy.
So, kind of kickstart the conversation, I wanted to inquire if you could go into a little bit more detail about what Panacea Plant Sciences does and how you ended up getting involved in psychedelics research.
So for Panacea, we'll start there, is we're basically similarly to kind of echo cannabis's, I kind of have to explain some of the science of psychedelics to get into that. Is I think that most of the people who hear this podcast are aware of the CB1 receptor and how THC and CBD interact with that, and the CB2 receptor. I think you could probably associate the HT2A receptor with the CB1 receptor in the regards that it has anti-inflammatory and also intoxicating, could call it, effects. And that's the primary receptor involved in the psychedelic experience as we know it. Although, just like with cannabis, that is a vast simplification. And there is also an entourage effect of compounds in, for example, psilocybin mushrooms interacting with a variety of receptors in the body. And so essentially our company is doing is researching the supply and chain and cultivation to increase yield and efficiencies for things like psilocybin, cannabis, and other psychedelic life forms. But then also on the other end, the looking into clinical studies that evaluate or preclinical that look at how those synergistic effects work on the body and in animal trials.
So, some of the substances that you mentioned are obviously Schedule 1 drugs. And I was curious what kind of obstacles you have to work around to be able to work with the kinds of molecules that you do.
So we're working with a variety of universities, such as I technically am under NDA, and so it'd be complicated. I'd have to get a disclosure for that, so I apologize here. But basically, and with these universities, they have Schedule 1 licenses. We'll be able to disclose a lot of that soon. It's just an ongoing process. And then what I can mention directly, for example, is Dr. Martin Terry, who is one of our advisors on our board, and then also works with us, is he has the only current license in the United States for the DEA for LAFA4-OAMZI, which is more commonly known to others as peyote. And so we, for example, are doing research with his cultivation site there with him. And then, it all requires DEA licensing. But what's also interesting is that there are compounds which are technically psychedelic or, that act on the 5-HT2A receptor that aren't actually controlled. And those allow for easier research. So we either have DEA licenses or work in the unregulated space, as well as working in other countries. For example, 5-MeO-DMT is not controlled in Spain or Canada.
Okay, yeah. Speaking of 5-MeO-DMT, we had a conversation before regarding sustainable psychedelics, and you've presented on that topic. And I wanted to discuss that a little bit, like what the concept of sustainable psychedelics is. And as an example, the 5-MeO-DMT is most correlated with the Sonoran Desert Toad, and it's become fashionable for some people to go to Mexico and to gain access to 5-MeO-DMT, and it's having its effect on the toad and its ecosystem. And I was curious if there were other sources of 5-MeO-DMT that were more sustainable.
Definitely. So for one thing, there's always synthesis. I'm not somebody who is opposed to the idea of things that come from synthesis. Of course, there's always the complications from how accessible is that to the common public. So getting into other sources is there's also other toad species that have bufotenin and 5-MeO-DMT that they found in other places which are not threatened. And that, for example, bufotenin containing toad, which bufotenin can also be converted into 5-MeO-DMT, is the cane toad. And the cane toad is actually invasive, and it's being eradicated. It's from the Caribbean, but it's invasive and overtaking ecosystems in Australia, for example. And so there actually is a potential way to help reduce an invasive species to supply bufotenin, which could be made into 5-MeO-DMT as well, is just one potential other way. But then there's also plants such as phalaris, and there's a few subspecies of that. So there's aquatica, as well as, oh man, they're Latin names, so I apologize. Arundacea, I believe. I'm probably killing these names. And a few others which contain the compounds as well. The danger is for the public to be aware of is that the phalaris species also contain gramine, which is a toxin.
So are there other psychedelics that offer these same, more, maybe not widespread, but other alternatives to for people to gain access to, as opposed to other endangered types of plants?
Decidedly, I'd say almost every psychedelic that exists can be done in a way that would be sustainable. For example, rather than people ever touching a Lophophora plant, a much easier to cultivate and much more widespread and non-threatened species would be, that contains mescaline, for example, would be Echinopsis or trichocereus, depending on which scientist you're talking to for the first name, but panchoi or peruvianus. And those two species are better known as either Peruvian torch or San Pedro, and for example. And then in ibogaine, there are species in Africa known as Tabernanthe iboga is the plant which traditionally contains ibogaine, and then there are plants which don't contain ibogaine. But if you imagine ibogaine as THC and this other compound as THCA, essentially you can extract volcangaine from Volcanga africana, and then you break that compound and it basically off, and it's a longer version of ibogaine essentially. And so I don't know if that would be synthesis technically. It's basically the equivalent of decarboxylation, but it's not carbon, so it's another process technically, just for demonstration purposes. And they've also found that there's species known as Tabermontana in Mexico, which are also not threatened, and that also have these Voacanga ibogaloid type molecules. And so those can be sourced that way. And then if you get into psilocybin, well, frankly, that's the way it's being done currently is, besides, maybe energy use or things would be environmentally damaging, but the overall model is not extracted from the environment.
Right.
So there's a variety. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's great information, because I think that a lot of times people associate some of these molecules with a single plant, or in the case of the toads, a single toad species. But you're saying that there's actually several options out there that people should be aware of, whether it be people looking to study this, or people looking to be part of a fashionable trend, and have that kind of experience.
Definitely, there's options, and I think it's important for protecting biodiversity. And then the other side is that many of these species are sacred to groups, and so if you can avoid the use of Lophophora because it's culturally appropriative to cultures, and utilize things that are other species. Or like with the toad, to use Phalaris, for example, which is sacred to no one because it has gramine and is dangerous. You can isolate the 5-MeO-DMT from that and then use it, and you have a natural source of a therapeutic compound that doesn't violate nature or an indigenous group's belief system. And I think that finding these third ways, if you will be better for everyone.
Totally agreed. And I think you may have been reading my mind there, because my next question for you was specifically, we had a conversation before regarding the effects of, hopefully this isn't a bad term to use, but Western science and medicine on indigenous populations that have used some of these psychedelic substances for millennia. And I was curious what your advice would be to anyone interested in these types of psychedelics. How can they better their own lives but also respect indigenous peoples?
I think a good first step would be to look up the Convention on Biological Diversity, also known as the CBD, and then the Nagoya Protocol. And those go over a lot of the issues regarding, this would be known as like bioprospecting or biopiracy. And every country outside of the United States and Canada almost, and I think then like North Korea and Angola and a few other countries we don't want to be lumped in with probably, are the only non-signatories of this. And it's an agreement which basically the international community has agreed that you won't develop plants or animals or species without the approval and benefit honoring sharing with the cultures in the regions where the plants or animals or life forms thereof are located. And the reason the US and Canada didn't do it is obvious. It's so that way companies can continue an extractive model of capitalism and colonialism. And so I think the key is to, as companies and scientists, is to do it voluntarily, even though we don't have to in the United States, would be the key in reaching out to groups before that are those who traditionally use these items prior to conducting a research experiment. If it's about a plant or an animal, and asking permission and asking how you could do it in a respectful way, because there's also the thing is a danger of categorizing or accidentally lumping indigenous groups into one category, because there are indigenous peoples are everywhere on earth, and so there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Even for the Native American Church for Lapa Four-Way-Umzai, there's over 400 chapters in the United States and Canada. So that's 400 groups using one plant. So, and they all have separate views on things. And so it's just complicated, but basically just the thing would be to find out who the groups associated are and to discuss it with them.
Yeah, that's I think something that's I had not heard about before. And after speaking with you and some connections from you with the Native American groups, it really was I guess I would say enlightening to me. So because I felt like I was not aware of some of these things. I was not aware that some plants, using certain names of the plants is frowned upon by some of these groups, and because it's a sacrament to them. So I think that as we all kind of strive to be better, that's an important facet to understand and kind of educate oneself on, because as you mentioned, some of these groups have used plants like this for a very long time, and it's really been a part of who they are. And I think that I don't get the vibe that the indigenous populations who have used these substances don't necessarily want anybody else to use these substances. It's just the fact that there's some respect deserved for them recognizing very long ago that some of these substances could really help them and help them achieve a certain level of life that I think a lot of us just have kind of lost or never had.
Definitely. And for example, the Buitui and Gabon spoke at the Horizons conference, and during that they mentioned that it is their belief that ibogaine can help heal the world. So they want it to be accessed, but it needs to be protected first because it's so threatened. And so I think that using other methods of accessing it will protect the iboga plant while allowing people to access the compound. But it is still the traditional Gabonese people and the Witwi culture that kept ibogaine and developed its use in sacrament that led to our knowledge. And so they should still be honored, even if you're not utilizing that specific plant. And the same thing would be towards, wherever culture the plant that you're using comes from. So I think that it's just learning a lot for everyone to learn. And the other side is that many of these cultures, it was actually made illegal for them to practice these religions when European cultures came in. So in Africa, during that time, during the 1800s to the 1900s, the people in the Congo and other regions where these plants are, it was outlawed for them to practice these rites and to have these plants. And in America, it was made illegal for Native Americans to practice this and to use lawful Four-Way-Umzai, and they were also taken in place into residential schools, which is being widely discussed now. And so while people feel that like everyone should have access to certain plants, when a plant is going extinct and one group has had the right to use it taken from them, and then that same group that took it from them wants to tell them that they should be able to use it, it gets complicated.
Yeah, it sounds very complicated, and I think that you were talking about like kind of almost like an access protection, and I just immediately was reminded of the CBD industry, where here was this mass surge towards this substance because it was now made legal. And a lot of people, I think, lost faith in what the molecule was and could do, because you started seeing it in every gas station, strip mall. I've said before that somebody I know said they saw like a gun store, and one side of the sign had like an assault rifle advertised, and the other side said something like now selling CBD. And it's I'm not saying that that would be something that would happen with psychedelics, but I'm saying that it seems like sometimes when the masses get access to something, you do see deleterious events happen, such as what I think may have happened with the CBD industry. And if everybody can kind of heal from it, I think that that implies not necessarily a clinical aspect, like you have to go into a clinic and ingest this substance, but there is kind of that medicinal element to it and best practices that these indigenous populations have kind of mastered. And so I think that we would be wise to include them in our own applications of these substances, and allowing them to have that kind of involvement.
Definitely. It's always again a complicated discussion, but it's something that we've been working with a variety of groups, and I think that they just want to be respected and to have their own. I mean, so for example, just like in the United States right now, Native Americans are still often worried about joining the hemp industry because of previous times when their crops have been destroyed when they tried to during the earlier stages. And technically, while in Oklahoma, cannabis is legal there for medical and being expanded for recreational, the tribal organizations there aren't involved because theoretically they actually have to follow federal law there.
Right.
And so it's, as we see the advancements of cannabis in the country, it's something that's almost leaving them behind. And at the same time, you have the illicit market previously, which was the people that kept us going, which were primarily people of color, and they're not seeing the benefits of legalization either of cannabis. And I think that's another parallel here to think of in terms of groups that were left out of the commercialization and benefits of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in our remaining minutes here, I wanted to talk about two things. We kind of flirted with some of the medicinal aspects of psychedelics. And I was curious, from your perspective, what psychedelic molecules do you find to be the most exciting from a medicinal perspective, but also from like a spiritual or cosmic or trippy perspective? Which ones do you think are the most interesting?
I'm more of a every color of the rainbow person for different uses. So on personally, but I think each one also will have. So I'd like to view it as each one having its own receptor profile fingerprint, if you will, similar to cannabinoids and terpenes. And so they all have their own unique activity, and so because of that, there's synergism. And so I think in the long run, we'll find co-usage of compounds for specific uses. And I think things like ibogaine will be found or demonstrated to be very anti-addiction for things like alcohol and opiates. And that we'll see parallels then with mescaline for alcohol and other anti-addiction things like that. And I think that for depression, we'll see a lot of psilocybin work, which is evident, as well as MDMA. And then I also believe that mescaline and MDMA, which are both phenethylamines actually, so the chemical class, will also end up being useful for PTSD and related conditions like that more than psilocybin personally, for a variety of reasons. There's slightly different receptor activity. And so I think really hone in on the differences in the receptor profiles, which relate specifically to the particular indications you're looking at. And then one thing that no one's talking about right now is the non-mental health aspects of these drugs. And for example, mescaline has been shown effective at treating brain cancer. was more effective in combination with chemotherapy. And separately, other phenethylamines have been shown in subacute doses to be effective for asthma. And then harmine and harmyl alkaloids actually are the only known compounds which have restarted beta cell growth. And beta cells are what create insulin in the body. And if you're type 1 diabetes, you're born without them or they're damaged heavily. And if you drink and use or eat badly or have some kind of poisoning, then you get type 2 where they get killed. And so I think that there's a possibility for psychedelics to potentially be cures for things like different cancers and diabetes even.
Wow, that's amazing. I really appreciated that answer because it really kind of summarized this, like you said, with cannabis, with all of the molecules kind of serving different purposes. Some of these psychedelics, either in combination or just using things for different aspects. That's really exciting, and I'm always kind of blown away by the research that comes out with, the swift pace at which these molecules can help humankind in all the different ways, from mental health to the ones you just mentioned. Before we end, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about your upcoming testimony regarding the potential for 5 additional molecules to be added to Schedule 1. I just wanted to know if you could take a minute or so and talk to the audience about that.
Thank you. By the time this airs, this hearing will have occurred, but currently there's 5 tryptamines, which are psychedelic compounds, and they're related to a variety of compounds from DMT through 5-MeO-DMT and psilocin in structure, but just slightly different to give just perspective. And the DEA basically is trying to move these items into Schedule 1, and we're fighting them against this. For example, one of the compounds is actually entering FDA trials for postpartum depression soon, and to have an item have items which are currently undergoing extensive investigation and nearing clinical FDA trials, to have them move into Schedule 1 just prior to that is insane to me.
Yeah, and we will definitely revisit with you after the hearing and have another podcast episode regarding what the experience was like and hopefully what the outcome looks to be from your time there. So I want to thank you for being our guest today. The work you're doing is really inspiring to me, as is the way in which you conduct yourself and your company with people who have been utilizing these psychedelic substances for far longer in medicinal and ceremonial ways.
Thank you for having me on and for continuing to help educate people about the variety of indigenous rights and scientific and regulatory concerns, so that way they can stay informed.
It's been a really great opportunity to do those things and to be able to educate myself on things that, like I said before, I definitely was naive to. Everybody, definitely tune in, watch for David's second episode with us, which will dive into that DEA hearing a bit more. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. We will see you next time on Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. Until then, please come visit us at www.terpenesandtesting.com or on one of our social media platforms. Cheers.